Good evening. Good evening to you here in the Oudemanhuispoort, as well as to our audience online. I'd like to welcome you for our 5th lecture in the UA lecture series on Ukraine. My name is Mariette Brolsma, and together with my colleague David Hollanders from European Studies, I will be your moderator today. It is my great pleasure. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Hannes Meissner, who came all the way from Vienna to Amsterdam, and he will speak today about the state of the Ukrainian economy. And Dr. Meissner is a political scientist who works as a senior researcher in the Competence Center for Black Sea Region Studies of the University of Applied Sciences in Vienna. And his research focuses on political risk analysis and political risk management of multinational enterprises in the post-Soviet region. And Dr. Meissner has a long-standing track record of carrying out long-term field research in Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Georgia, but also in Ukraine. And you've been to Ukraine, you just told me, for research in October, so only a few months ago. You're also an academic coordinator of the Chamonix network Yukon, which explores the relations between the Eurasian Economic Union and the European Union, particularly with regard to conflicts and cooperation between the EU and the EU. And you lecture at the University of Vienna, and Dr. Meissner, sorry, lectures at the University of Vienna, and has published widely on political risks, governance initiatives, and post-Soviet transition processes. And I saw not just in academic journals, but also in nationwide newspapers, such as the Süddeutsche Zeitung and the Wiener Zeitung. In his lecture today, he will draw on his field research done in October 2021 in Kiev, and the lecture will focus on economic developments in the last 3 decades in Ukraine. It's very interesting. You will also deal with the impact of the war and with possible prospects for the future. Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Meissner, again for being here. I look very much forward to the lecture. And as all of you will know from the previous lectures, after the lecture, which takes about 35 minutes, there will be plenty of room for all of you to ask questions. Okay, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here again in Amsterdam. I know your team, Christian Noah, for quite a while. So we had another project years ago focusing on Russia. And now we have another Erasmus Plus Chamonix Network project. I'm the academic coordinator of, and that I've been to Ukraine very often in the last decade. Focusing on the business environment there, political factors, the institutional political environment, how this environment impacts on enterprises, and how enterprises can manage those risks associated with the political and institutional environment. And from this perspective, I will give you an overview over Ukraine and the state of the economy, the transition process. It will have a strong political science approach. I'm a political scientist. I'm going to outline the environment, and when we look at Ukraine, the character of Ukraine, we first of all have to say it's a country in between the East and the West, in between the developing world and the developed world, and also in terms of economic development, it's a country, when we look at the global average, a country in the lower middle area. Well, politically, it's also a country in between autocracy and democracy, a so-called hybrid regime. Well, it's first of all a very complex country, and it's a country of with huge economic opportunities, but a country that is to a high degree characterized by the failure of economic and also political reforms since independence in 1991. And in this regard, I would like to give you a brief overview. First of all, some data more characterizing the Ukrainian economy, the cleavages between the East and the West. And then I'm going to look at the permanent transition crisis the country suffers of. And in this regard, after introducing some general GDP data, we will look into the history of failed reforms, because I think that's very important to understand this history, those factors, why Ukraine is not a country as prosperous as Middle European countries, Central Eastern European countries like Poland, Czech Republic, because also in transitional research, it's always the question, why did some countries from belonging to the former socialist world, why did some countries proceed very well and quickly in terms of economic and political reform, and other countries failed? Ukraine to a high degree failed. Good question, and I would look into that. After that, we will focus specifically on recent pre-war developments under Zelensky, and finally, I'll give you an outlook on war scenarios and well, the future of Ukraine. So we also do business consulting, and we have good sources in Russia, and I just spoke to one of those sources today about, well, what's happening in Ukraine, what Russia is thinking of recent developments, and well, I would give you a brief insight into what the information I gained today, and how that will determine the future of Ukraine politically, socially, economically. Well, Ukraine, when we look at the transition history and the history of failed reforms, first of all, we have to say that Ukraine had a good basis, actually. It was in the post-Soviet world, in the Soviet world, and in the Soviet Union, it was one of the most developed countries. It was an economic powerhouse. The Soviet economic model, you know, the Western countries in the Western sphere of the Soviet Union, they had the function, they fulfilled the function of producers, or the industry was there, while in the peripheral region, the countries were the raw material providers, and Ukraine had a very important role, first of all as a grain producer, and secondly in regards to heavy industry, especially in eastern Ukraine. It was in Soviet terms quite developed. Today Ukraine is still one of the major grain producers, so 60 million tons of grain is produced in Ukraine yearly. It will drop significantly this year. You know that under the conditions of war, of course, and over which 50% is exported, and that's also the reason for the ongoing discussion why the war in Ukraine will have an impact on food chain and especially in emerging countries, Africa. Well, in recent years, the service sector developed quite dynamically. In this regard, we cannot see any east-west cleavage, especially Kharkiv was one of those powerhouses in this regard, but also Kiev and Lviv, Lemberg in the western region. So, of course, we saw some developments, but the question is now, why did having had such a good basis, why did the country not develop in terms of wealth and socioeconomic growth? Well, Ukraine is rather characterized, or has been characterized until the war. Of course, the war has been a game changer now, has been characterized by permanent transition crisis. When we look at GDP growth rates since 1990 until 2020, we can see, a slight increase, but also an up and down. It first of all bent down significantly in the years after gaining national independence until the early 2000s, when the Ukrainian economy grew. Then in 2009, in the world economic crisis, there was a major decrease in GDP growth. Then, well, it again started growing slowly. Then another downturn in 2015 in relation to the Maidan revolution and the annexation of Crimea and the war in eastern Ukraine. And then again it went down, went up slowly, but not in a huge manner. When we compare that to other post-Soviet states, we can see that GDP growth and the economic development of Ukraine was much below the levels we could observe in other post-Soviet countries, especially in Azerbaijan, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Russia. Russia has, as you can see, almost 3 times the GDP as Ukraine. But one thing we have to take into account: the other countries are either resource-rich countries with a huge influx of gas and oil resources. We can see that in Azerbaijan, the Black Line, for example, between 2004 2006, the economy grew significantly, but that was due to the influx of oil and gas resources. And with the inauguration of the 2 gas pipeline and a new oil pipeline, Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline at the same time, and during this time, oil prices are raised significantly. So that's something we always have to take into account. So the other post-Soviet states are not as good in this regard as it looks at first sight. But when we look at Central Eastern European countries like the economy of Poland, we can see here again the economy is always 3 times the size than Ukraine, and Poland definitely is a non-resource rich country. By the way, when we look at Belarus, not a resource rich country, but they used to have a lot of rents from transit of gas. Well, why did the country not develop? And that's actually my research focus. I'm working at the University of Applied Sciences and the University of Vienna. It's political risk, and political risk are factors going back to the political institutional environment of countries, having a negative impact on business operations. And this regard, this perspective here, we see businesses as a motor of economic growth. And in this regard, we can see several factors and structural causes that are responsible for this. The fact that businesses could not develop very well, and economic growth was hampered. First of all, Soviet legacy, like in the other post-Soviet states, corruption is systemically rooted. The judiciary does not function very well. There's no real guarantee of property rights. Elites are corrupt. Well, we can see a state capture constellation in Ukraine with a strong oligarchy. And this is always, state capture is always related to the constellation that elites, oligarchs, family members, families capture state institutions and then gain power to realize their own particularistic interests at the expense of independent enterprises and not well-connected enterprises. Well, political stability, a huge factor. We've seen 2 revolutions: the Maidan revolution and the Orange Revolution in 2004. Externally, the war, now of course we have war, but before that we could see and observe a very long tradition of conflict with Russia, and this unsafe environment had a severe impact on FDI, on business operations in the country. Well, some few words about the history of failed reforms. In this regard, we can structure the history of Ukraine into 4 phases. The first phase is the 1990s until the Orange Revolution in 2004. Then the Tymoshenko-Yushchenko years of rule until 2010. In 2010, Yanukovych came to power. Yanukovych was a pro-Russian president. And he was overthrown in the Maidan Revolution in 2014, and well, then the 4th period are the post-Maidan years under Poroshenko and Zelensky. But let us look at that step by step. Well, in the 1990s, until the Orange Revolution under Leonid Kuchma, he was prime minister in 1992, 1993, and then president until 2005. We could see in the first decade, you could observe a heavy transition crisis. Related to the dissolution of the Soviet economic system, you know, the different republics were very much embedded into a joint system of cooperation and delivery chains and production chains, very much related on other republics. And when one republic did not produce or deliver any more, production also stopped in other republics. That is one reason for the strong heavy downturn in the 1990s. Also the strong reforms that were implemented back then, quite radical market reforms. What we could see in the 1990s, and that's really decisive to understand Ukraine until today, is that during this time, the oligarchy we still know today emerged. So under Kuchma, he favored regional elites. He brought them into power, regions from different elites from different regions of Ukraine, and they used the privatization process. They used the power they had to accumulate more power, business, economic power around them, and that is the start of the oligarchic system. Well, in the late 1990s, those oligarchs that captured the state. It was not Kuchma back then anymore who was the real person with all the power, but the oligarchs. And the oligarchs, they also established media empires, and well, the fact that we have different power centers by different oligarchs, that's also a major reason why in Ukraine we have a certain degree of liberalism, and within this liberal order, liberal space, revolutions took place, democratic elections took place. But the fact still that is that there are different oligarchs outweighing their power. Unlike in Russia or Kazakhstan or Azerbaijan, where strong leaders emerged and who centralized power. This is also one reason why in those countries we can see a much stronger autocracy than in other countries like in Ukraine. Well. In the 1990s, Ukraine saw a dramatic economic collapse, but in the 2000s, in the early years of the millennium, the economy grew significantly, which was mainly driven by external factors. Globalization had a high pace at that time, so it was not due to internal reforms or the internal business environment, but rather externally driven. Well, Tymoshenko in 2004, there were the accusations of electoral fraud on two sides. Well, on the one hand, the pro-Western camp of Tymoshenko and Yushchenko. On the other hand, Yanukovych, the pro-Russian leader. In the end, Yushchenko, Tymoshenko, they well, won thanks to the Orange Revolution, but they did not implement real economic reforms in the years after. So Yushchenko was described as a dreamer, only thinking of Ukrainian history, looking into history books while neglecting reforms, and Tymoshenko, she became the so-called gas princess, well, enriching herself in gas contracts, by gas contracts with Russia. So real economic reforms did not take place, and then in 2008-9 we saw the immediate effect of the world economic crisis with a significant downturn of the GDP. Well, in the years after, so there was a lot of frustration among the Ukrainian, in the Ukrainian society. And well, in 2010, Yanukovych won in free and quite fair elections, and that showed that this old pro-Russian leader that was ousted by the Orange Revolution, that he won in democratic elections in 2010, was a sign how frustrated the population was already in that time. And well, in the years after, the business environment deteriorated significantly. So that is the first time when I went to Ukraine to carry out research on political risk and political risk management strategies for Austrian and German enterprises. That is a very bad time, actually, because well, Yanukovych and how they call it, his clan of apparatchiks and gangsters from Eastern Ukraine, well, he ousted all the people in the bureaucracy, the so-called wave from Donetsk, because he was rooted in the eastern part, and he brought into, well, all the old people from the bureaucracy had to leave, and he brought in his new people. And under his rule, corruption and political risks reached a very high level. And well, this high level of corruption was one reason for the Maidan revolution, also in this regard, the revolution of dignity. So you see the normative value of approach behind this revolution in this regard. Well, but at the same time, the revolution was triggered by the fact that, despite of the fact that in the beginning Yanukovych tried to counterbalance Russian and Western economic interests, in the end Russia put a lot of pressure on him to suspend the EU association agreement and sign a free trade agreement on the Eurasian Economic Union with Russia instead. And well, people feared of, you know, the country turning to the east, to Russia. They looked at Europe. That was another major reason of the revolution back then. Well, during this time, due to high political risks, the economy did not really recover significantly, and also in the years after, under Poroshenko and Zelensky, well, first of all, there was a huge downturn in economic growth due to the huge war in eastern Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea. In the years after, the economy recovered with moderate growth rates, but here again, we have to say that the growth rates remained far below the potential of the country. Production, wages, investments slowly increased. But here again, during this period, under Poroshenko and under Zelensky, both leaders, both presidents did not succeed in implementing far-reaching economic and political reforms. Well, some interesting pre-war developments I would like to share with you. First of all, the reduction of trade dependence on Russia, one very, very significant and interesting issue until 2015, of course. Ukraine was very much embedded into this post-Soviet environment of economic interdependence. But yeah, in 2012, Russia was by far the most important trading partner. 25.7% of exports went to Russia, and 32.4% of imports came from Russia. But then in 2014, that changed with the association agreement Ukraine signed with the EU. On Russia, on the other hand, cancelled the free trade agreement with Ukraine, and that led to a change, a significant change. Trade between Russia and Ukraine dropped by 85%. So this is really a significant rate, and today today in 2021, trade with the EU was the EU was the most important trading partner. When we break up the EU into individual countries, it was actually not the EU, but China is the most important trading partner, followed by Germany, Poland, and Russia only in position 4. Well, foreign direct investment, you could see the huge peak in the years between 2006 and 2008. It dropped significantly, and in 2015, FDI reached the 0 level due to the Maidan revolution, war in Ukraine, annexation of Crimea. Then FDIs grew again, but never reached the same level as in the second half of the millennium years anymore. Well, Zelensky. It's a good question, because right now Zelensky looks like the defender of European values, the European model, economically, politically. In the beginning, all his promises really looked as if he wanted to break with oligarchic transitions, but the implementation of reforms widely failed. So not in all areas. Whenever new institutions to fight corruption, to reform the legal and environment, the judiciary, whenever new institutions were established, he was quite successful. But whenever he wanted to reform the administration and also the bureaucracy, the judiciary, he widely failed. In the beginning, there was a higher pace of reforms, but it significantly slowed down in the first year of his presidency. His popularity dropped significantly during this time. So we should not forget that in terms of reforms, he widely failed. That leads me to a final question. Is he an oligarch himself? That's a question I've been asked quite often, also for the reason that whenever a president or a leader wants to break with oligarchic rules, he himself needs to act according to liberal rules. And there have always been accusations in this regard that he might act in favor of Igor Kolomoisky, one of the country's oligarchs. He is a billionaire, and his TV station broadcasted Zelensky's soap opera, Servant of the People. Well, in the soap opera, Serving of the People, Zelensky acts as a president fighting corruption. So that was also one reason why people, he really played a role, and that led to high expectations. Well, Zelensky's opponents always accused him of huge dollar flows from Kolomoisky on his personal accounts. The Pandora Papers, at least, they in fact revealed that Zelensky has a extensive network of offshore companies, and that he personal benefits from huge money transactions. And here again, when you talk of state capture, it's always that when a president or somebody favors his own people, friend, and that's what we call state capture, and we certainly can see signs of state capture under Zelensky as well. People close to him, people from his hometown, Kryvyi Rih in southern Ukraine, the people he personally knows, they were favored, they got good positions in the state and in the economy. Well, at the end, I would not give you a clear answer on is he an oligarch himself, because in the end it's always a question of the gray, and it's never black and white picture, but often something in between. But what we can see and what's fact is that reforms failed, that we still have a state capture constellation, and that he also has his own network. Well, coming to war scenarios and economic perspectives as an outlook now in the end, well, Russia's attack on Ukraine, that's certainly a turning point in the history of Ukraine, but also in the history of international relations. We see a dramatic economic downturn now, of course. So war is always the most severe political risk for enterprises. Well, enterprises, but when production breaks down in war areas, delivery chains break down, production facilities are destroyed, people have to flee, your workers have to flee, employees have to flee or get killed. So that's always the worst case scenario when we speak of political risk, and it's not surprising though for that reason that the effects of the war are dramatic. So I found some recent IMF data with saying that GDP will most probably drop by 45% this year. Well, where will this all lead to? And today I spoke to a source of mine, a very well-informed source in the post-Soviet space, and I spoke, well, he was a source who I spoke to before the war, and who told me that the war would come. So I didn't believe that in the beginning, I really have to say, but well, in the end, it turned out to be different, and that's also was right, and that's also today when I spoke to the source, the source said that, well, maybe plan A did not succeed in terms of a quick change of government, a quick a quick military victory over Ukraine, but that's Putin, Russia has always had a plan B and a plan C as well, so it's all going now according to plan B, and the goal of Russia is to destroy Ukraine, total destruction, separation. The eastern part should become part of Ukraine, the western parts demilitarized and also conquered. So to destruct the country and get it out of the grip of Western Europe, that's the goal, and nothing has changed. Putin will go on, they have all the time they need. They will do it slowly, steadily, and with military means and also subversive means. So what are the scenarios now? Scenario one is a long war with Russia, despite of the fact that Russia is gaining more and more control over prevailing over the Ukrainian economy, but very slowly shows that, well, in the end, maybe Russia might win. It will be a long war, or maybe, and that's the other scenario, that it will never have a real victory of Russia, but a long-lasting war with ceasefires ongoing and new escalation step by step. Well, and what we can definitely say, this is the worst case scenario in terms of economic growth and political risk. So we won't see any FDIs, any economic recovery. We will see further brain drain, people leaving the country. FDIs will not go into the country under these conditions, even if the EU will implement help programs and economic stabilization efforts. Well, a ceasefire is less likely. Maybe we'll have ceasefires and so, hello, I'm back. There were some technical problems, but yeah, please, there's one question in the chat. No, please unmute. We can't hear Hannes, so there is no question.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. In the scenarios you described, I missed the North Korea-South Korea scenario, because that could lead to a very strong new kind of Ukraine with a permanent presence of Russia in the West, but Russia will only lose money there and it will probably be a completely empty country, I think. So what do you think is the likelihood of this scenario? This is one. And the other one, what are the economic interests if you take the balance between the West and Russia in Ukraine?
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, in terms of that scenario, that on the other one hand, well, that Ukraine might be separated, the eastern parts get under the control of Russia, the western parts under the control of the EU. Well, of course, every scenario, there's some likeliness, and this might be a scenario. Me personally, I think it's not so realistic, because well, that would need stability or ceasefire and a clear dividing line. And I do not see any well, realistic possibility that Russia will stop there and give Western Ukraine to the Western world and be satisfied with Eastern Ukraine. My impression is that Russia will take Eastern Ukraine and will do everything to destabilize Western Ukraine, and if not conquer Western Ukraine. And under those conditions, when people flee, when you have no stability, no peace, how can, well, the EU with support programs will not reach much, actually. In terms of Ukraine as an economic bridge between the East and the West, is that your question?
And of course, the interest as well. What the interest of Russia economically in the East?
Yeah.
What could it be? Because it looks like this is just draining money.
That's true. Of course, historically, Ukraine, the eastern parts are better and more developed than the western parts. The western parts have the agriculture, eastern parts heavy industry, but of course that would need a lot of investments to modernize and get it to international standards. But I think, you know, that's one of the miscalculations I also did, because I did not expect the war, frankly speaking. In the agenda of Russian interests, economic interests are not in position number one, but security interests, historic nationalistic interests, the interest of becoming a great power again, and incorporating Ukraine into the own sphere of influence. And that's a security issue and a nationalistic issue, and that's above economic interests, and that's what I really believe what we have to be aware of. I think we were really used to thinking in economic terms and economic interests, because well, we measure our life in terms of socio-economic wealth, and the history of European integration was a very successful history in this regard. But Russia, well, that's another approach. It's another perspective. It's not our perspective, and that's, I think we have to understand that.
But maybe, if I may add, I was just reading an article by Fukuyama, who wrote that this war is about more than just, say, geopolitical interest, but more about autocracy against democracy.
Yeah.
So that's the interest for the Western world, to have maybe a kind of South Korea situation where we really put a limit to what they can do.
Yes, I also believe that it's not only about nationalistic and security interests when looking at Russian interests in that war, but also, you know, defending autocracy. And in the past, and I've looked at that very, very carefully in the past, you could always hear this argument in Russia that Ukraine, the brother nation, like other Orthodox nations, is not ready for this Western model. But Ukraine looked at the West, and they started to implement reforms. At least civil society put a lot of pressure on that. There were revolutions, and for Putin, this was certainly a threat for whole power in Russia. And in Belarus, those are the only post-Soviet countries where we still have those KGB elites in power. In all other post-Soviet states, and generation change has taken place. So these are really those old, fierce KGB security service elites fearing of losing power.
Okay, so I have two related questions actually. The first one is, what about the economic development of Crimea since 2014? And the second one is, could this be an indicator of how regions such as Donetsk or Lugansk be developed in a certain scenario?
Thank you very much for your questions. Well, actually, I haven't done any studies on the economic development of Crimea, so I cannot give you any in-depth or real information on that. Well, at the same time, I think it's hard to compare Eastern Ukraine, Donetsk, and Lugansk with Crimea. Crimea for also strategic interests. Well, going back to Soviet times, the Russian Marine has its stations there. Eastern Ukraine is more, you know, this heavy industry region with production facilities going back to Soviet times, but there's a huge need of modernization. But still, in both territories, Russia would have to invest and transfer huge subventions in order to make it, well, more sustainable, at least, you know, move something there economically. Certainly in Eastern Ukraine more than in Crimea. So Crimea is for many reasons also, you know, it's not, it has a different economic structure, but I'm actually no expert on Crimea, so that's for that reason I cannot give you any detailed information.
But could it be the case that Russia would use the opportunity to make an example, like for example, with those prestigious projects such as this Kursky Mosque for example? And yeah, that's the question.
Well, Russia is certainly able to do that. They have the power. Well, they can use gas and oil rents or profits for those often white elephant projects. And Russia did so in the past, not only well, like this bridge project, but also inside of the country. At the very same time, we have to consider well, that the sanctions weaken the Russian economy, but they weaken the non-oil and non-gas sectors. Actually, the sectors that would be very important in the years after the ecological revolution and when oil and gas resources are depleted. So, but right now, yes, whenever a ruling elite can dispose freely over gas oil rents, they can use it for their own purposes. And well, prestige projects are often a measure, you know, to prove that something is going on, that progress is taking place. And so we've seen that in Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan to a very high degree, and Kazakhstan as well, Russia maybe to a lesser degree than in the other peripheral resource-rich post-Soviet states. But yes, I would expect that Russia will do some white elephant projects in eastern Ukraine. Well,
maybe you could say that there is some scenario in which some part of Ukraine could be developed even like in the long term.
Yes, well, there is always the scenario that there is a Putin's overthrown, that you know, war will stop, or that we will have a clear ceasefire line and a clear separation of the West and the East. I really believe it's unlikely, but this scenario, of course, it is a scenario. But then it would still be necessary to reform the business environment, to get rid of state capture, corruption, the oligarchy. Well, Western agents and institutions put a lot of money into the Ukrainian economy in recent years, and a lot of that, a huge part, was siphoned off. And you know, it would need a strong conditionality, it would need a strong implementation, and you know, the entire business environment, that there's a huge need to reform that and get rid of state capture, oligarchy, and political risk, and how to achieve that. So that's really very, very difficult.
Makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your very insightful presentation. You raised a very interesting question, and if Mr. Zelensky is an oligarch, or is not, I would like to know how would you explain the origins of his first billion, which he within 4 years could generate. And as a follow-up, Mr. Poroshenko doubled the number of billions he had, and Mr. Yatsenyuk made his first billion as well, the Prime Minister under Mr. Poroshenko. He made his first billion. How would you explain such a big success in financial sense of those politicians?
Well, I have no clear answer on that, of course, because I do not look into this black box of how he makes money. But the fact that he makes money in an otherwise poor economic environment, and that he makes money as a politician or a person connected to oligarchs, other oligarchs, that shows that he's part of the state capture system, at least, and that he took personal benefit from that. So there were a lot of rumors in this regard, but the Pandora Papers, they provided evidence that this took place. So of course that's always the big question in all of those countries. When actually in most emerging countries in the world, when a president has an annual salary of $100,000, for example, how can it be that they end up with millions or billions of dollars in the end? So it's always a state capture constellation, and most cases they taking, well, they have their own businesses, and well, they favor their own businesses. They have the presidential power. They can channel funds into their own businesses, grant themselves licenses, benefit from privatizations, and often also from corruption money collected from the environment around them. Well, to what degree Zelensky is an oligarch, or that's still an open question, because we always have some insights into the black box. So that's an open question, but he certainly benefited from the state capture constellation by personal gain.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I'm in the European Studies department, and I'm very much interested in relations between the EU and Russia. And I heard recently, we have read that approximately 10 to 11 countries of the EU have sent already military equipment in support of the Ukrainian army. So I was wondering, we also are being bombarded with the images of refugees from Ukraine who are reaching for refugee in Europe. And I was wondering whether we are entering a new era of new relationships between the EU and Russia, because we have actually, we could say that we have involvement of the EU in the Ukrainian war, provided that some countries are sending military equipment. And I was wondering if all this war, how important will be in shaping our perception of Russia and leading towards a more coherent approach, for example, in relation to our economic relations in the West, or more specifically in the European Union to Russia. For example, we know that before the war, and I'm not sure also today, there are exchanges of gas, natural gas between, for example, Germany and Russia, or there are plans. And I was wondering whether this event that is historical is going to influence the economic relations between the EU and Russia. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. I certainly believe that this is a historical critical juncture now in many regards. The Western world is closing in. They defend their economic model, their social model, societal model, and government model. And on the other hand, we have authoritarian rule, not only in Russia, but also in China. And that's a dividing line between, well, a normative dividing line, but it has strong impact on economic relations. So we are cutting our relations to Russia right now by imposing sanctions. Western enterprises are withdrawing from Russia, they say, for a certain period of time, but we do not know if this will be permanently, also for the reason that Russia wants to expropriate those companies, or at least they said they would do so. And especially when the war is going on and when we have no immediate solution or near future solution, this will be a new dividing line. And I also believe it will not only be an economic dividing line, but also kind of a new Cold War. And so, you know, the entire world order has changed, and it's been overthrown, destroyed by Russia, that we do not make wars against other countries, and that we rely on contracts and norms and values at the international level. But of course, Russia is not the only player in this regard changing the world order. It's also China, of course. We saw that China, you know, they do it much in a softer way. a more cautious way. But China is also a new player in this world order. But actually, I believe that in the end, Russia will not win this struggle. They're destroying the current world order, but won't be the winners in the end. I believe China will be the winner in this game.
Okay. Many thanks for your highly interesting lecture and also for sharing the information you got from your Russian source that you spoke yesterday. It's very interesting, it's very worrisome. I have two questions from the chat from the audience at home. And the first one is from Christian Nova. And Christian asks, only in the course of the war we came to realize the international weight of certain sectors of the Ukrainian economy, above all agriculture. Are these estimates overblown, and what does it mean that the agricultural sector is still so important? Is it also controlled by certain oligarchs?
Hello, Christian. Nice to meet you. And thank you very much for the question. Yes, I really believe the agricultural sector that has a special position in this regard, for the fact that Ukraine is a very important producer in this regard. As I outlined earlier, 50% of grain production is being exported, and also to the developing world. That's a important factor, and the war has a devastating effect on that. I do not believe that we really overestimated, because in the end it's maybe not only the question whether there won't be any grain be delivered and exported, but also the fact that prices will raise significantly, and especially in emerging countries with a poorest population, this will pose major issues in terms of whether they still are able to buy it, either because of the fact that it's not being delivered or that it is becoming too expensive. Well, in terms of the agriculture, I believe, but that's a good question. Actually, I have no hard data on that. I did some research in Ukraine in the period under Yanukovych, and back then. Well, I interviewed some Asian and Austrian companies that wanted to invest in the agricultural sector, and they were harassed, blackmailed there as well by people in power. In the end, they were not able to do business in the agricultural sector on a larger level, but. To be honest, in fact, I cannot tell you whether the agriculture or parts of the agricultural sector, what parts are controlled by what oligarchs. But certainly you need good connections to oligarchs in order to be active in the agricultural sector as well.
Thank you. Yeah, Christian, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Christian.
Okay, maybe there's one other question from the chat. Do you think Putin thought through all the sanctions he and his country and friends and family are now facing? I guess this is more of a general economic question, but will Russia be able to function? I'm thinking, just for one example, about how they're on the brink of default.
Well, here again, I spoke to sources, and they all, before the war, and those sources said that Putin would not be afraid of the sanctions, but he did, and they also said he did not expect heavy sanctions. So I think the sanctions are much stronger than what well, the elite and Putin expected. But in the end, it's the question is rather, will those sanctions have a strong impact on Russia or Russian politics, on the economy? Certainly, maybe not today, because what we sanction is especially the businesses and in the non-gas and oil sector. So in terms of long-term socio-economic development, this will have very negative effects on Russia, especially in the post-oil and gas era. But right now, I think the effects are not so strong, because for warfare and political stability, when we talk of political stability, it's only a small circle of people with and they certainly depend on redistribution of money. In terms of military actions, of course, that's also costly. But yeah, Russia still has huge gas and oil incomes from the export, and they can use it directly. So I believe as long as there won't be any tough sanctions against the gas and oil sector, the effects won't be so strong. So, well, economic data is predicting a downturn of 10 to 15% GDP this year in Russia. Well, in terms of what Russia has experienced in the past, that's nothing so special, actually. So they had a huge downturn in the late 1990s, and well, I think it will harm people, the general and wider population. They are used to that, but it will not harm directly Putin. And so I'm not very optimistic that this will change, these sanctions will change and anything or end the war.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Meissner, for your highly interesting lecture and sharing also with us your thoughts about the future and the sanctions, the state of the Ukrainian economy. Thank you again for coming all the way from Vienna for giving this lecture.
Thank you very much. Really great pleasure to be here. I enjoyed it very much. Thanks a lot for the invitation.